So I want to talk about shame and guilt. And these are things that I think have plagued myself for a long time. And a lot of us go through a period of either having shame or feeling guilt. And the difference is shame is a part of your internal. You can be guilty about something, not have shame for it. Shame is like internalizing some part of that guilt and then making that part of your personality or you as a whole. So for example, you could feel guilty for, let's say, not behaving in a certain way or being a jerk, right? You could be guilty for that. But you can have shame for years and years neglecting friendship or neglecting what duties of a father or something like that. Like you could have shame for that. So all of us have, I think, parts of guilt, but then we also have those parts of shame. Once we can realize that we can feel guilty, but not internalize that and become shameful about it, then we can allow those feelings to kind of process and then let them go, get rid of them. And because shame is, we can't go back in the past, so we can't go back and fix these events. We can try to make up for them. And I like in the AA, I'm not really into AA, but the AA has Alcoholics Anonymous. They have this part of their 12th step is like making amends when you can't. And sometimes they say if you can't make amends, let's say if you did something to hurt someone, and then if you were to go back and apologize, that would hurt them more, then don't do it. But part of taking back ownership of your life and removing that shame is to go back and make amends to people that maybe you kind of screwed up. But that's why it's a lot of alcoholics and an addict. We have a lot of shame because I think we internalize a lot of things that we feel that we either had no control over, or we feel like that society kind of looks down upon. So we internalize these things, and I think naturally, even as children, we learn to internalize these things. And a lot of the things could be silly. We're told as a kid growing up, you were not smart and that everything you did was stupid, right? Just like an older brother or a parent or whatever. We can internalize this feeling of guilt for not being a certain way. And as we get older, we still haven't processed those emotions, and a lot of times we don't even know where they're coming from. And so these feelings of shame, they dictate us. Whereas having guilt is just normal. So we have this mechanism in us that allows us to know, like most of us, at least the non-seriopathic people, right? So most of us, we have this feeling of guilt that like, okay, I did something to you and I feel guilty, so maybe I need to reflect and to go back and maybe fix that. So it's kind of like a mechanism to keep us going on a straight line, so to keep us going down the right path. But as children, we didn't have that mechanism really set up. So either our parents were trying to create that, or we were trying to create it on our own because we didn't have any of these boundaries. So we created our own shame guilt mechanism. So usually what would happen is you would have multiple series of feeling guilty. Let's say of you failing a test and you felt guilty. You internalize that to feel shame as a student or something. Feeling shame for your sexuality or feeling shame for the person that you are. And so feeling guilty, it's needs. Like we need to have guilt so that way we're not just complete a-holes. But having shame just is a part of our internal mechanisms, not really understanding it. Shame kind of guiding us down the wrong path. We could be shamed for things that we have even no control of. Like I would say that I carry shame as being oversensitive, right? Because I was always told as a child that I was too sensitive. So anything that I would ever talk about, like boundaries, I don't like when you do this, I would be told that, oh, you're too sensitive. So I would be shameful. I'd be shamed. Like shun, shun, that's where it comes, shamed, shun. It's like I would be shunned that to speak up. And so then I came and internalized that as myself, and then I became shameful for a part of me who was naturally sensitive and was a good thing, but I was looked down as a bad part. There's this book called The Trauma That Binds Us, and I always had this feeling with the past, and I think we all have that feeling with the past that only if we could go back, we can make a difference. Only if we could have done that event differently. Only if we could have chosen a different path, I wouldn't be here. Only if I knew what I knew now, imagine where I would be. And I think that it's know what we know now and choose a different path. But it's like our brains just want to always look back and to have some sort of this guilt and the shame on the choices that we made, and then internalizing it as part of us. So, and that's why alcoholics and addicts, they have this huge part of shame, because I mean, imagine years and years of you addicted to a substance that is basically controlled you and has made you do things that you probably wouldn't normally do. And so then you're in this cycle of shame. So you feel shame, and then you try to remove that feeling, and you don't have any other methods. So you just drink or do drugs, and that's just kind of like, and then you feel guilty about that. So then you feel shame again, and then it's like this ongoing cycle. So you can have guilt without feeling shame. So, but usually if you have guilt and you ongoing and you keep feeling guilt, then you'll have, but it's like we have the past, we can't change it. Obviously we could have done things better, but it's like we could all sit there and say, hey man, like look at how silly, look how stupid I was. Like, well, what is that going to do? Nothing. And it's going to, all it's going to do is going to take all your energy. One is, if you're living in the past, you're going to keep creating it into your reality now, because all you're doing is focusing on the past. And so that's why people say, I can't make any changes in life and I feel so stuck. Well, you're feeling stuck and you feel like you can't change is because you're constantly reminding yourself of the past and keep going back to the past and keep saying how stupid I was. Well, everyone could make changes if they knew like what the future holds, right? But the thing is it's so hard to cut off that cord. It's like you're tied to a weight that's drowning you to the ocean, but it's like you keep holding on to it, and you have to cut that cord in order for you to even to grow, in order for you to create a different future. But it's obviously a lot harder than that. But I'm telling you, is the more that you can realize what are the shameful things that you have with these feelings of shame, then we can kind of go back and try to unwork them and try to remove those feelings, because otherwise you're just going to keep creating the same event. 5 years go by and you still haven't done anything, and you're like, why? Because you haven't changed, you haven't done anything different, because you haven't seen yourself differently. I think that's a huge thing, is that we see ourselves in the past as we do today. We are not the same, because in the past we didn't have the information that we know now. Of course you made the choice back then but without the knowledge that you know now. But you want to keep going back there and saying how stupid I was to make those choices, but you can't. So it's like you have to cut that cord. And like, the past is information. That information, now where do I go with this? So I have this guilt from these things. I understand why I have guilt, and that serves as a mechanism so that I don't do those things again, but I don't hold those inside internally as part of shame, and then I don't go in the future and carry that along with me. And I think Tony Robbins says it. He says it's an identity, like especially like if you're a smoker, like smoking was my identity, right? And so when you quit smoking, it's like now you are changing your identity. And if you don't change your identity as someone who doesn't smoke, then you're going to keep smoking. If you don't change your identity as someone who doesn't, then you're going to keep drinking. And so that's why some people have a problem with addictions and saying that addicts are, if I say I'm an addict, then I'm kind of saying that I have a problem, instead of saying I used to have an addiction problem, I don't have any. I mean, both sides kind of have their arguments, but regardless, it's like we have to create new identities so we can go forward, and it has to be without shame, because shame is always going to tie us back, and shame is much more powerful than guilt, because guilt could just be temporary, where shame is like a part of you. Shame is like, and when you feel it, when you say the word shame, it's like you can sense it in your body. It's part of like internally and rooted inside you. In the book, The Trauma That Binds Us, he talks about shame, and he talks about shame is that a lot of it is passed on from generation. So it's like we're holding on traumas from our parents that had their trauma from their parents and passed on. And until we can work out those traumas, then we can let go of those shame. And so it's like, that's why we have to communicate. We have to talk about this stuff, or else we get stuck, and then we hold on to shame, and then we repeat the cycle. We can't go forward unless we do something about this if we have shame. And so we all have something that like in the past, but I think as you realize that you can't make those change, you can't do anything about it, you can't change the past, then you kind of get to a point where you're like, I have to live my life, you know? Maybe in a certain time of your life, you get to a point where you're like, life is only so short that I can sit here for so many hours thinking about the past. It's not going to get me anywhere closer to where I want to go. And I only have so much time to fulfill my dreams and whatever I want to do with my life, that this past is like, that's not who you are anymore. It's just an identity. It's just, you have characteristics that maybe from the past you, but that's not you. You're a new person. And that's why when people say that, oh, people, you can't change. It's like, no, you can change. You can change into a new identity, into a new person, but it just depends on if you really want it. And people who say that, they don't really want it. So you can allow them to sit back there in the past and keep doing what they want. But the guilt, also another thing of think about is like awareness, is if I could be guilty about something and another person cannot, like is not guilty. So guilt is also internal, that it's objective. Like I can think it's guilty, but you can't. So what is, it's not real. It's made up in our heads. Like some religions might say feel guilt or shame for doing something, and another religion might say no. So who is to dictate really what is shameful, what is guilty? And I think that a lot of it comes down to how you feel, and using what's internally inside you as a whole, as like a spirit, as a soul, and how you feel about that, I think more important than any sort of rule or religion. Something that's plagued me for a long time, and until you can kind of cut that cord, you're always going to be stuck back in that loop, and you're never going to make those changes. So guilt is part of shame. Shame is a part of you, but we can decide which part we want to be. We don't have to be either, and we can just move on and create a new future.